bring in Gustavo De Carvalho from the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gustavo, a very good evening to you. Good to have you on the SABC. So Donald Trump in the last few hours saying he's not meeting with Putin on Friday to make a deal. But is this the first, shall we say, significant or best, in fact, shot at an actual truce between Moscow and Kyiv?
Thank you so much, and good evening. Certainly what we see with this meeting, there is a mix of diplomatic theater and realpolitik chess. We see on the one hand President Trump trying to show that he's still a deal maker, that he's still able to bring parties together. But on the other hand, we're going to see President Putin coming to showcase not only Russia's positions, but also that Russia is not the country that is actually blocking the discussions towards achieving some kind of a deal or a ceasefire at this stage. It will be interesting to see how President Trump utilizes this meeting, whether we're going to see some of the more unpredictable theatrics and some of the very forcive approaches that we've seen in many of the meetings that Trump had this year with heads of state. But at the same time, I think it is an important process, and especially if we see from the conversations of European leaders with Trump earlier today on discussions about a potential trilateral conversation between the US, Ukraine, and Russia. Whether they will be successful or not, I think is still very early, and we've learned this year that being unpredictable is something that we should be expecting. But it's a new dynamic that we haven't seen since the beginning of the war.
It's also interesting, isn't it, because Donald Trump, the deal maker, has been trying to temper, if you will, expectations, really manage expectations, first saying that he's not going there to come back with a ceasefire deal, but he's also saying he believes there is the possibility of a second meeting with Putin, which he believes would then make more significant progress. Why do you think he's playing it safe in terms of his expectations going into Friday's engagement?
I think because no one really expects that this is a conflict that is going to be resolved in only one conversation between heads of states. Even if we were to see some kind of a ceasefire being presented, there is much deeper structural issues that the two countries have, whether it's in issues related to territorial concessions, whether it's in terms of the role of NATO in the region, where there is a number of issues that would still have to be discussed, and that is not something that you can discuss without all of the parties involved. And that's partially why that anxiety that we've seen from Ukraine and Europe this week, that have been visibly sidelining many of these discussions, because for any successful truce or successful ceasefire or peace agreements to be held, this is something that tends to take much longer than just one meeting between two heads of states.
On Ukraine and the EU, because the EU has been Kyiv's most unshaken, unwavering ally in all of this, how much of the cards do they hold in this scenario? Because it appears to have been in the last while reduced to a Trump-Putin show.
Absolutely. And they do have many cards still. Like at the end of the day, none of those decisions that would be made would be possible without Ukraine or even Europe, considering geography in that sense matters, proximity in that sense matters. But it is interesting to see how the US actually plays its own leverage that it has in the situation, and how much is actually able to really get to an agreement. I think it's still a little bit early to tell, and even if we see something perhaps concrete presented, you need to involve countries in the region, and we've seen that in conflicts in other parts of the world, that if the parties involved are not fully on board with whatever decision is taken, the likelihood of a failure is very high.
And at a White House briefing on Tuesday, the American administration was very deliberate to state outright, in fact, that it was the Russian president who initiated this upcoming face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump, historic as it will be in Alaska. What does that tell us about the future of the war from Moscow's perspective, but also where the state or the power play stands, if you will, where the Kremlin is concerned?
I think from the Kremlin side, certainly it gives them an opportunity to show that they have leverage within the situation, to show that despite their own perceived position of strength within the conflict, we have seen very little movements within the front lines already for almost 2 years now, and the Russian territorial conquests have so far been somehow stable. But for them there is this idea and opportunity for the Russians to also show that we are not the barrier for a peace here. It is Ukraine and Europe. And how much will Trump actually buy into that idea in the meeting, I think is also particularly important, because it will give a sense of what the next steps will be, what kind of interactions between those 4 different parties, Europe, the US, Russia, and Ukraine, will have in next steps. And so far, none of the parties have all of the cards, if we want to use Trump's analogies that he often uses. But at the same time, it will be an important signifying moment to see how the US and Russia in particular are playing that game and how they will be presenting it.
And 2 final questions, Gustavo, that I'm hoping we can wrap into one. The first being, Donald Trump, despite saying this first meeting is not likely to produce a concrete end to the war with Ukraine, saying that there will be very severe consequences if President Putin does not agree to stop the fighting. What leverage does he have to force Putin's hand in that regard? And secondly, whatever happened to that African effort, which President Cyril Ramaphosa was part of, where African heads of state were hoping they could play a role in brokering peace? Is that dead in the water?
Yeah, so I think on your first question, I think certainly for Russia, they're already severely affected by sanctions, meaning that there is not much more than can be done in that regard. Certainly now we've seen Trump targeting some of the countries that are dealing bilaterally with Russia, and India in particular has been one of those cases. I think it's been quite clear that a lot of the ultimatums and pressures that the US has been doing are quite limited. Now, when it comes to the African initiatives, I think we've seen President Ramaphosa already in the last couple of days having conversations with Zelenskyy, with Trump, with Putin, and being part somehow of those discussions. I don't think necessarily that African countries would be the main players when it comes to that, but I think they do have a lot to offer, considering that increasingly South Africa interacts very regularly with Ukraine, interacts very regularly with Russia, which does provide other avenues for different layers of conversations, even if it's in relation to some of the more specific issues within that.
Good to have your time. Gustavo De Carvalho from the South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for speaking to us tonight.